The October sun hung low over Silicon Valley, turning the glass towers of Blackwood Aerospace Technologies into mirrors of gold and ambition. Vivian Blackwood stood in the executive parking lot, microphone in one hand, champagne flute in the other, surveying her kingdom with the satisfaction of someone who'd never questioned whether she deserved it. 50 executives formed a loose semicircle around her, phones already out, smiles already forming in anticipation of whatever performance their CEO had planned. The quarterly innovation showcase had become Vivian's favorite ritual over the past 3 years, a chance to see what toys her people had bought with their bonuses, what symbols of success they'd chosen to display. The lot gleamed with excess. 3 Tesla Model S sedans occupied the prime spots near the entrance. A BMW i8 caught the afternoon light, its hybrid engine a statement about caring for the planet while maintaining status. Someone from Advanced Systems had arrived in a Porsche Taycan that cost more than most Americans earned in 3 years. And tucked near the executive entrance, partially hidden by a delivery van, sat the VP of Operations' second car, a Mercedes EQS he'd purchased just to have options. Vivian loved this, loved the visible proof that Blackwood Aerospace took care of its own, loved the way success built upon success, each achievement layered like sediment forming rock. Her gaze swept past the gleaming vehicles to the far corner of the lot, where the sunlight seemed to die against something that didn't belong. A Mustang. 1968, maybe 69, the kind of car that should have been in a restoration shop or a junkyard, not parked among vehicles that cost 6 figures. The paint had faded to the color of dried blood. Rust spread across the hood like a disease, eating through metal that had seen too many California summers and not enough care. The passenger door hung slightly crooked, hadn't closed properly in what looked like a decade. Chrome that should have gleamed was pitted and dull. Vivian raised the microphone, her voice carrying across the parking lot with the practiced projection of someone who'd learned early that volume and confidence were often the same thing. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the future of transportation. The crowd erupted. Camera flashes lit up the October afternoon. Someone shouted about junkyard chic becoming the new trend. Another voice called out asking if the vehicle ran on hopes and prayers, maybe dreams of better days. Vivian let the laughter build, riding it like a wave, feeling the rush that came from being at the center of attention, from knowing every person in this lot wanted to be her, or be near her, or be acknowledged by her. 30 feet away, separated by luxury vehicles and years of invisible labor, Garrett Sullivan stood with a mop handle gripped in hands that bore the calluses of real work. The gray coveralls hung loose on his frame, not because they were too large, but because he'd lost weight over the years, his body consuming itself slowly in the way of men who forget to eat when grief becomes routine. 52 years old, but the mirror showed 60. Shoulders bent not from age, but from the particular posture of someone who'd spent too long making themselves small, trying to take up less space, attempting to become part of the architecture rather than a person who might be noticed. He'd been pushing that mop bucket across the lobby floor when the noise from outside pulled him toward the glass doors. 4 years he'd worked here. 4 years of existing in that peculiar space where people looked through you rather than at you, where you became furniture that occasionally moved and required a paycheck but otherwise merited no attention. The rust on the Mustang's hood spread like fractals, each patch of oxidation a small failure compounding into larger decay. The passenger door hadn't closed right since 2014, when the latch mechanism finally gave up after years of resistance. Paint faded not just from sun, but from neglect, from the absence of care that happens when a man has nothing left to give, because everything went to keeping one thing running. Not in the executive lot of a $4 billion aerospace company, not surrounded by vehicles that cost more than most houses, not where Vivian Blackwood and her executives gathered to celebrate excess. Donovan Pierce materialized beside Garrett with the particular smile of a man who measured his worth by the fear in other people's eyes. 42 years old, Harvard MBA, VP of Operations, the kind of executive who kept a Tesla for daily driving and a Porsche for weekends because one car couldn't contain the breadth of his success. Garrett, Vivian wants to see something. The request landed like an order because that's exactly what it was. The false courtesy of powerful people who'd learned that please and thank you made demands feel like invitations. Garrett leaned his mop against the wall, feeling the weight of attention even before he turned toward the doors. 4 years of invisibility about to end. 4 years of careful silence about to shatter. He followed Donovan through the glass doors into sunshine that felt too bright, too exposed, too much like stepping onto a stage when you'd spent years in the wings. The crowd parted. Expensive shoes on asphalt that maintenance had sealed just last week. Designer suits that cost more than Garrett made in a month. Faces turned toward him with expressions ranging from curiosity to amusement to the particular cruelty that comes easily to people who've never had to worry about being cruel. Ah, there he is, our guest of honor. Vivian's voice carried across the parking lot, amplified by speakers someone had set up for maximum effect, for making sure everyone could hear, for ensuring this moment would be captured and remembered and possibly shared on whatever social media platform executives use to broadcast their wit. Garrett stopped walking. Every face trained on him like cameras, like weapons, like the kind of attention that strips you bare whether you want it to or not. Donovan gestured forward with the impatience of someone who had places to be, deals to close, a life that mattered beyond this parking lot theater. Come on, don't be shy. We're doing our quarterly innovation showcase. You know the drill. Everyone shows off their new rides, talks about the future of transportation. I thought, why not include everyone, even our support staff? Laughter rippled outward from Vivian like stones dropped in still water, each circle of amusement spreading wider, encompassing more people, until the whole lot seemed to vibrate with shared mirth at Garrett's expense. He felt his jaw tighten, that old familiar tension of swallowing words that wanted to come out, of keeping silent when speaking would only make things worse, of maintaining the invisibility that had kept him safe for 4 years. 43 years old, and Vivian looked 35 with her blonde hair pulled back tight enough to hurt, wearing a designer suit that probably cost more than a semester at Stanford. She'd never learned his name in 4 years. Walked past him every morning like he was part of the architecture, a fixture that occasionally required maintenance, but otherwise merited no acknowledgement. Now she wanted him on display. That is your car, isn't it? The vintage model? More laughter, louder this time. Someone whistled. A phone camera clicked, then another, capturing this moment for posterity or entertainment or whatever purpose people found in recording the discomfort of others. Garrett stood very still and thought about Elena. Thought about the night she died, holding his hand in that hospital room, barely able to whisper because the cancer had taken everything but her will, her voice reduced to breath shaped into words. Don't let them bury it, Garrett. Don't let them win. Thought about the engine hidden beneath that rusted hood. The engine Elena had helped him build. The engine that could change everything if he let it. If he stopped hiding. If he was willing to pay the price of being seen. Something shifted inside him then, like tectonic plates that had been pressed together for years, suddenly finding the fault line and deciding to move. 4 years of invisibility cracking like old paint exposed to sun and rain and the relentless pressure of holding everything in. You want to see if it runs? The laughter stuttered and stopped. Vivian raised an eyebrow, champagne halfway to her lips, the glass catching sunlight and throwing small rainbows across the asphalt. Donovan's hand landed on Garrett's shoulder with pressure that suggested retreat, with the weight of warning, with the unspoken message that this was his chance to back down before things went too far. Garrett, maybe you should just... But Garrett was already walking toward the Mustang, already committed to whatever came next, already past the point where careful silence could protect him. The crowd parted again, this time with confusion replacing amusement, with whispers starting up behind him like wind before a storm. What's he doing? Is he serious? This should be good. He reached the car and put his hand on the door handle. Metal warm from afternoon sun. Familiar. Comforting. The physical anchor to 15 years of memory and loss, and the stubborn refusal to let go of the last thing that mattered. The door opened with the squeal of hinges that needed oil, that had needed oil for years, that would probably always need oil because some things you lived with rather than fixed. Garrett slid into the driver's seat, and the smell hit him immediately, rushing in like atmosphere filling a vacuum. Old leather and motor oil and something else, something only he could identify after 15 years of breathing it. Elena's perfume. Faint now, almost gone, probably more memory than reality, but still there, still with him, still anchoring him to a time when the world made sense, and love was real, and the future stretched out like a road with no end. He put his hands on the steering wheel, worn smooth by his grip over thousands of miles, over years of driving with nowhere to go except away from pain and toward the memory of better days. His eyes closed. "I'm sorry, Elena. I tried to stay invisible, but they won't let me." Then he turned the key. The engine didn't sputter, didn't cough or wheeze or groan, or make any of the sounds you'd expect from a 50-year-old car with rust eating its hood and parts that should have failed years ago. Instead, it sang, a deep, smooth, powerful harmonic that rolled across the parking lot like thunder before rain, like the voice of something that shouldn't exist, but did anyway, like proof that the laws everyone accepted weren't actually laws at all, but just limitations people had agreed to live within. The sound was unlike anything that crowd had ever heard, not from a car, not from a plane, not from any machine ever built by human hands following human understanding of how the world worked. Pure, perfect, alive in a way that made every other engine in that parking lot sound like crude approximations of what propulsion could be. The laughter stopped. Every single person in that parking lot went silent. The kind of silence that comes when your brain receives information it can't process, when reality breaks its own rules right in front of you. Garrett revved the engine, once, twice, 3 times. Each time that impossible sound filled the air, vibrating in their chests, making their teeth hum, rattling something fundamental in their understanding of what was possible. Vivian's champagne flute slipped from her fingers and shattered on the asphalt, crystal exploding into fragments that caught the light like stars, like the moment when everything you thought you knew revealed itself to be incomplete. Garrett killed the engine, stepped out of the car, walked back toward the building without looking at anyone, without acknowledging the silence he'd created, without giving them the satisfaction of seeing how much this moment cost him. Vivian's voice chased him, all the mockery stripped away, replaced by something raw and hungry and desperate. Wait, what was that? What kind of engine? But Garrett was already gone, disappearing through the glass doors, returning to his mop and his bucket and his invisibility, leaving behind a crowd that stood frozen like people who just witnessed something they couldn't explain. Because they had. They'd witnessed a miracle. They just didn't know it yet. Vivian couldn't sleep that night. She lay in her penthouse bedroom, 37 floors above San Francisco, staring at the ceiling while that sound replayed in her mind with the persistence of a song you can't forget. That engine, that impossible engine. She'd been around cars her whole life. Her father had built Blackwood Aerospace from a small auto parts manufacturer into a global giant worth billions. She'd grown up in garages and factories, surrounded by the smell of gasoline and the roar of combustion engines, learning the language of torque and horsepower before she learned algebra. She knew what machines sounded like, knew the rough idle of American muscle, knew the precise purr of German engineering, knew the electric whine of new technology trying to replace old ways. That smooth, perfect, almost musical sound was not something any machine should be able to make, not according to the physics she'd learned, not according to the limits everyone in the industry accepted. 2 in the morning, and she reached for her phone, dialing Donovan without checking the time because CEOs didn't apologize for urgency, didn't acknowledge that other people might need sleep or rest or lives beyond serving the company. He answered on the third ring, voice thick with interrupted dreams. Vivian, do you know what time? I need you in my office tomorrow morning. 6 you can find on Garrett Sullivan. Employment history, background check. I want to know where he came from, where he worked before, what he did before he started pushing a mop around my building. Silence stretched across the line like elastic pulled to its breaking point. Then Donovan's voice came back sharper, more awake, calculating what this meant for his career trajectory. Vivian, it's 2 in the morning. You want me to investigate the janitor? Did you hear that engine today? I mean, really hear it? Yeah, it was different, I guess. Old car, probably has some custom work. Different. Vivian sat up in bed, adrenaline burning through her exhaustion like acid through metal. Donovan, I've heard engines from Ferrari, from Lamborghini, from military jets that can break the sound barrier. I've never heard anything like that. Not once. Not ever. She could hear him breathing on the other end, processing, understanding that when the CEO called at 2 in the morning about the janitor, it stopped being about the janitor and started being about something that could make or destroy careers. 6 a.m., don't be late. She hung up and lay back down, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Garrett Sullivan's face as he walked back into the building. No triumph, no satisfaction, no revenge for being humiliated in front of 50 executives. Just sadness, like a man carrying a weight too heavy to bear, but too precious to put down. Donovan was waiting in her office at 5:45, which meant he'd probably been there since 5:30, preparing, making sure every detail was perfect, demonstrating the kind of dedication that kept VPs employed and promoted. A thin folder sat on her desk, thinner than she'd expected, thinner than it should be for a man who'd worked at Blackwood for 4 years. Vivian picked it up and started reading, coffee growing cold in her other hand, the San Francisco morning spreading gray light through her corner windows. Garrett Sullivan, 52 years old, born in Boston to a working-class family, Irish-American roots running deep into neighborhoods where you learned early that the world didn't give you anything you didn't take for yourself. Bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from MIT, master's from Stanford. Vivian stopped reading. Her coffee cup made a sharp sound against the desk, porcelain on wood, like a gavel announcing judgment. Wait, MIT? Stanford? Donovan leaned forward in his chair, and for the first time she saw something in his expression that might have been respect, might have been fear, might have been the recognition that they'd stumbled onto something bigger than quarterly innovation showcases. It gets better. After Stanford, he spent 12 years at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, worked on propulsion systems for deep space missions, published papers that people still cite, won awards from organizations that don't give awards lightly. The guy was a rising star in aerospace engineering, someone people expected to change the field. Vivian felt something cold creep up her spine, the kind of cold that comes when pieces start fitting together in ways you don't want them to. When the comfortable narrative you've been living reveals itself to be incomplete. Then what the hell is he doing mopping my floors? That's where it gets weird. Donovan pointed at the folder, his finger steady, but his voice carrying an edge of uncertainty. About 15 years ago, he just disappears, leaves NASA, drops off the grid completely. No publications, no patents, no employment records, nothing. He goes from being someone everyone in aerospace knew to being no one at all. Then 4 years ago, he shows up here, applies for a janitorial position with a fake resume that lists him as a high school dropout with no work experience beyond manual labor. A fake resume. Vivian's mind raced through implications, through possibilities, through the question of why someone with credentials from MIT and Stanford and NASA would lie their way into a janitorial job. Whoever did his background check didn't dig very deep. Or maybe they just didn't care. Who investigates janitors? Who spends resources verifying that the guy cleaning toilets actually dropped out of high school like he claimed? Vivian stared at the folder, at the gap in Garrett Sullivan's life where 15 years should be but weren't, at the mystery of a NASA engineer turned janitor hiding in plain sight. The question wasn't just why. The question was what else he was hiding. Donovan reached across the desk and handed her a printout. Paper yellowed at the edges from 15 years in some digital archive, preserved but aging like everything else that time touched. There's one more thing. I found this from right before Sullivan disappeared from NASA. The headline read, "Aerospace Engineer's Wife Loses Battle with Cancer." Below it, a photograph of Garrett Sullivan looking younger, thinner, his eyes hollow with grief that hadn't yet learned to disguise itself. He stood beside a hospital bed where a woman smiled despite the tubes in her arms, despite the shadows under her eyes that spoke of months of treatment and pain, and the slow recognition that some battles can't be won. Her name was Elena Sullivan. She was also an engineer, also brilliant, also someone the field had expected great things from. She died at 41 years old, her potential converted to past tense, her future reduced to memory. Vivian read the article 3 times, each reading revealing new details, new implications, new questions that had no easy answers. The couple had been working on something together, some kind of advanced propulsion system. The article mentioned it briefly, called it a revolutionary energy recycling engine, used words like breakthrough and paradigm shift, and the kind of hyperbole journalists employ when they don't quite understand the technology but know it matters. But there was no other information, no patents filed, no follow-up research, no indication that the work continued after Elena's death. Like the whole project had just vanished into the same void that swallowed Garrett Sullivan's career. Vivian set down the printout and looked at Donovan, really looked at him, trying to read in his expression whether he understood what they were looking at. "I want surveillance footage. Every camera in the parking lot. I want to see what he does with that car when no one's watching." Donovan hesitated, and Vivian saw him weighing the request against whatever remained of his ethical boundaries, whatever lines he'd told himself he wouldn't cross in service of ambition. Do it. The footage arrived at 6 that evening, delivered via encrypted file transfer with timestamps and camera angles logged in spreadsheets that showed someone had taken the request seriously. Vivian locked her office door and watched alone, the San Francisco skyline darkening outside her windows, the city lighting up like circuits on a board, millions of lives being lived while she tried to understand one. The first video showed Garrett arriving at work at 5:30 in the morning, parking the Mustang in the far corner of the lot, same spot every day, the kind of consistency that speaks to routine or obsession or both. Nothing unusual, just a man going to work early, committed or avoiding something at home. Impossible to tell from footage alone. The second video showed him leaving at 11 at night, 3 hours after his shift ended. 3 hours of time unaccounted for by any clock he punched or any supervisor who tracked him. He didn't go straight to his car. Instead, he walked to the trunk, opened it with the careful movement of someone who knew exactly what was inside, pulled out a small toolbox that looked old and well-used. Vivian leaned closer to the screen, coffee forgotten, the rest of the world forgotten, everything narrowing to this grainy footage of a janitor working on a car in an empty parking lot. Garrett popped the hood and started working. The camera angle wasn't great, positioned for security rather than detail, but she could see him adjusting things, connecting wires, checking gauges on some kind of handheld device that glowed faint blue in the darkness. This wasn't casual maintenance. This wasn't a man changing oil or checking fluid levels or doing the kind of basic upkeep anyone could learn from a manual. This was engineering. This was someone who understood systems and theory and the difference between making something work and making something work well. She fast-forwarded through 3 weeks of footage, watching the same pattern repeat with the consistency of ritual. Same time every night, same careful approach, Same hours of focused work that no one noticed because no one thought to look. Nobody noticed. Nobody cared. He was just the janitor, just part of the background, just someone who cleaned up other people's messes and merited no attention beyond making sure he showed up. Then she found it. In one clip from 11 days ago, Garrett disconnected something from the engine. A fuel line, maybe. Vivian couldn't tell for certain from the angle, but she could see him step back and reach into the driver's side window. The engine started. That same impossible sound even through the poor audio quality of parking lot surveillance. And the fuel line stayed disconnected. No gasoline flowing, no combustion happening in any conventional sense. The engine ran for 10 minutes before Garrett shut it down, reconnected the line with the same careful precision he'd used to remove it, and drove away like nothing extraordinary had happened. Vivian paused the video, her hands shaking, coffee long since gone cold, the San Francisco night pressing against her windows like it wanted in. An engine that runs without fuel. An engine that recycles its own energy. An engine that sounds like nothing else on Earth because it operates on principles that shouldn't work, according to everything she'd been taught about thermodynamics and physics and the laws that govern motion. My God, what did you build? The next morning, Vivian called Garrett into her office. He came still wearing his gray coveralls, hands rough and calloused from years of work that left permanent marks. The kind of hands that told stories about labor and endurance and refusing to quit. He stood near the door like he was ready to flee at any moment, like an animal that had learned caution through experience, like someone who understood that powerful people calling you into their office rarely meant anything good. Sit down. Garrett didn't move, his eyes fixed on some point past her shoulder, his posture suggesting that compliance was a choice he hadn't yet made. Vivian tried again, softer this time, recognizing that orders wouldn't work here, that whatever was about to happen required something closer to negotiation than command. Please. Slowly, he lowered himself into the chair across from her desk, perching on the edge like he might need to leave quickly, like staying was temporary and contingent on her next move. Vivian studied him for a long moment, really seeing him for the first time in 4 years, seeing past the coveralls and the invisibility he'd cultivated to the person underneath. He looked tired, worn, like a man who had been running from something for a very long time and was only now starting to wonder if running had been the right choice. I did some research on you. MIT, Stanford, NASA. You were a propulsion engineer, a good one from what I can tell. Awards, publications, people who still cite your work 15 years after you vanished. So I need to understand something. Why are you here pushing a mop around my building? Garrett's expression didn't change, didn't reveal whether her words landed or bounced off the armor he'd built around himself. That was a long time ago. Not that long. 15 years isn't ancient history, Garrett. You could have worked anywhere. SpaceX would have hired you in a heartbeat. Boeing, Lockheed, any of the big aerospace firms would have been lucky to have you. You could have started your own company, raised capital, built something that mattered. Why here? Why this? I needed a job. Vivian leaned forward across her desk, abandoning pretense, abandoning the careful dance of executive communication in favor of directness. You're hiding something. That car of yours, that engine, I've heard a lot of engines in my life. I've never heard anything like that. So either you're going to tell me what it is, or I'm going to find out another way. And I promise you, my way will be less pleasant than yours. For the first time, something flickered in Garrett's eyes. Caution. Maybe fear. Maybe the recognition that 4 years of invisibility was ending, whether he wanted it to or not. It's just an old car. Then you won't mind selling it to me. Silence filled the office like water rising, like atmosphere thickening, like the moment before thunder when you know the storm is coming but can't yet hear it. I'll give you $50,000, cash, today. More than that car is worth by any reasonable measure. It's not for sale. $100,000. Number $200,000, Garrett. For a rusted piece of junk that probably shouldn't even be street legal. Nobody says no to that. Nobody. Garrett stood up slowly, unfolding from the chair with the careful movement of someone whose body hurt in ways that didn't show, whose pain was old enough to be familiar. I should get back to work. $500,000. Vivian's voice rose despite her best efforts to maintain control. Despite the executive training that taught you never to show emotion in negotiations. Despite knowing that volume was weakness disguised as strength. $500,000 for a rusted piece of junk with a weird engine. Nobody says no to that. Nobody with any sense. Nobody who understands what money means. Garrett turned to face her fully, and for a moment the exhaustion in his eyes was replaced by something else. Something hard. Something angry enough to break through 15 years of practiced invisibility. You really don't understand, do you? His voice came out quiet, but sharp enough to cut, carrying the weight of years compressed into seconds, of loss transformed into words. You see that car and you think money. You think opportunity. You think asset that can be acquired and exploited and turned into profit. But that's not what it is. That car is all I have left of my wife. Every time I turn that key, I hear her voice. Every mile I drive, I feel her beside me. That engine represents 7 years of our lives working together, believing together, building something that mattered. You can't buy that. Not for $500,000, not for $500 million, not for any amount you could offer, because some things aren't for sale. Vivian felt something twist in her chest, an emotion she didn't recognize, didn't want to recognize, didn't have a category for in the careful taxonomy of feelings she allowed herself to experience. Maybe guilt, maybe shame, maybe the uncomfortable recognition that she just offered to buy something sacred with money that suddenly seemed inadequate. Everyone has a price, Garrett. That's just how the world works. Everyone wants something, and money buys everything, eventually. No, he shook his head slowly, sadly, like a teacher watching a student fail to understand a lesson that should be obvious. Everyone doesn't have a price. Some things are sacred. Some things matter more than money, more than success, more than whatever you built here. But you wouldn't understand that, would you? You've never lost anything that couldn't be replaced. You've never had to choose between integrity and survival. You've never had to watch someone you love die knowing that the system is rigged against people like us. He walked to the door, then stopped without turning around, his voice carrying across the office with the finality of doors closing. I know who your father was. I know what he did, what he built, and I know what he destroyed to build it. Vivian's blood went cold, her breath catching in her throat, the room suddenly too small and too bright and too full of implications she didn't want to examine. What are you talking about? But Garrett was already gone, the door swinging shut behind him, leaving her alone with questions that had no answers, and a fear that was just starting to take shape. Vivian spent the rest of that day trying to focus on quarterly reports and production schedules, and the 1,000 small decisions that kept a $4 billion company running. But her mind kept returning to Garrett's final words, like a tongue probing a loose tooth. I know what he destroyed to build it. Her father, Colton Blackwood, had died 7 years ago. Heart attack in his office, still working at 72, because men like him didn't retire, didn't slow down, didn't acknowledge that time applied to them the same way it applied to everyone else. He'd built Blackwood Aerospace from nothing, turned a small auto parts manufacturer into an empire that employed thousands and shaped the future of flight. He'd left Vivian a fortune and a legacy she was still trying to live up to, still trying to prove she deserved, still trying to expand because standing still felt like falling behind. But he'd never talked about the early years, never explained where the initial capital came from in an industry that required massive investment before any return. Never detailed how he'd acquired the patents that launched the company into aerospace rather than staying stuck in automotive parts. Never mentioned who he'd worked with before he became Colton Blackwood, founder and CEO, the man whose name meant innovation and excellence. "There are things you don't need to know," he'd told her once when she was fresh out of business school, curious about the company's origins, asking questions he deflected with the skill of someone who'd practiced deflection until it became reflex. "Things that don't matter anymore. What matters is what we built, not how we built it." She'd accepted that answer then. 22 years old and eager to prove herself, willing to take her father's word as gospel, trusting that successful men knew which truths were worth telling. Those things mattered now. She could feel it like pressure building in her skull, like the sensation before a migraine, like her body warning her that ignorance was about to become dangerous. 4 in the morning, and she couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking, couldn't shake the feeling that she just kicked over a rock and found something writhing underneath. She reached for her phone and dialed Fletcher Hayes, her godfather, her father's oldest friend, the man who'd been there at the beginning and knew things he'd never volunteered. He answered on the third ring, voice thick with sleep and age. "Vivian, do you know what time it is? Tell me about Garrett Sullivan." The silence that followed stretched so long she thought the connection had dropped, thought he'd hung up, thought she'd pushed too hard too fast. Then his voice came back changed, careful, weighted with the kind of caution people use when they know the conversation they're having could destroy things. "How much do you know?" "I know he worked at NASA. I know he had a wife who died. I know he had technology that someone stole from him 15 years ago. What I need to know is whether that someone was my father." The silence returned, heavier this time, carrying implications that made her chest tighten. "I think you'd better come to my house. There are some files your father left with me. Files he never wanted you to see. Files I've kept because burning them felt like complicity, but showing them felt like betrayal. Come now, before I lose my nerve." Vivian was in her car before Fletcher finished speaking, driving through San Francisco streets empty except for delivery trucks and people whose lives operated on schedules the rest of the world never saw. The city looked different at 4 in the morning, stripped of pretense, showing its bones. Fletcher lived in Atherton, 20 minutes from Stanford, if traffic cooperated, in a mansion that spoke of old money and careful investment, and the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself. He'd known Vivian since she was born, had bounced her on his knee, had given the eulogy at her father's funeral, with words that made Colton sound like a saint rather than a businessman. Now he stood at his front door at 4 in the morning, an old man in a bathrobe, holding a manila folder that seemed to weigh more than it should, that carried the gravity of secrets kept too long. "Your father was a complicated man, brilliant in ways that terrified people who work for him, ruthless in ways that made rivals fold before they even tried to compete, capable of great kindness to people he deemed worthy and great cruelty to people he deemed obstacles. Sometimes both in the same breath, sometimes to the same person, sometimes without seeming to recognize the contradiction. Did he steal the Aurora engine?" Fletcher sat down heavily in a leather chair that had probably cost more than Garrett's annual salary, that represented the kind of comfort people bought when they had more money than they knew what to do with. Steal is a strong word. Lawyers would argue about definitions for years if anyone had the resources to make them argue. But yes, in essence, in every way that matters, yes, he handed her the folder with the reluctance of someone passing over evidence of a crime they'd witnessed but never reported. Vivian opened it with hands that wanted to shake but wouldn't, with the discipline of someone who'd learned early that showing emotion was showing weakness. Inside were documents, legal papers yellow with age, patent applications stamped with dates from 15 years ago, and a handwritten letter in her father's unmistakable script, the precise cursive of someone who'd learned penmanship before computers made handwriting obsolete. She started reading. 15 minutes later, she looked up. Her face had gone pale, bloodless, the kind of color that comes when your body redirects resources to survival rather than appearance. He destroyed them. Garrett and his wife. They came to my father for funding, for partnership, for help bringing their work to market because they believed in it and believed the world needed it. And he took everything, buried the patents in legal structures they couldn't navigate, threatened them with lawsuits that would bankrupt them if they tried to fight back. Used the law as a weapon because he could afford lawyers and they couldn't. Fletcher reached out and took her hand with the gentleness of someone who'd watched her grow up, who remembered when her biggest problem was choosing which college to attend. He saw an opportunity. A young couple with no money, no connections, no way to defend themselves against someone who'd spent decades learning how to take what he wanted, and technology that could be worth billions if properly exploited, if kept away from competitors, if controlled absolutely. Your father was many things, Vivian, but sentimental wasn't one of them. He saw value and he took it. Simple as that. Brutal as that. Vivian stared at the letter in her hands, at her father's clear and precise handwriting, documenting his own crimes like an accountant logging transactions. Acquired Sullivan thermal regeneration patents via legal settlement. Team estimates suppression costs at $2.3 million over 5 years to prevent all claims and challenges. Technology worth billions in long-term aerospace applications. Sullivan couple will never recover financially or professionally from legal pressure. Project Aurora terminated from their end. Technology secured for Blackwood interests. Her father's words. Her father's strategy. Her father's legacy built on theft disguised as business. And now, her inheritance. I mocked him. I humiliated him in front of the whole company. I offered to buy his car like it was just property, like money could solve everything. I fired him when he wouldn't give me what I wanted. The whole time he knew. He knew what my father did, and he never said a word. Never threatened, never demanded, just worked and waited. Fletcher squeezed her hand gently, the gesture carrying decades of affection and the weight of complicity he'd carried since helping Colton build an empire on stolen dreams. The question now is, what are you going to do about it? You can't undo what your father did. Can't bring back the years Garrett lost. Can't resurrect Elena Sullivan or give her the recognition she deserved. But you can choose what happens next. You can choose to be different than Colton, or you can choose to be exactly like him. Either way, the choice is yours now. Vivian looked at the folder, at the proof of her family's betrayal, at the truth she could no longer avoid or ignore or pretend didn't exist. For the first time in her life, she had no idea what to do. The sun rose through Fletcher's study windows, painting everything in shades of gold that felt like mockery, like the world refusing to acknowledge that darkness existed. Vivian sat holding proof of her father's crimes, while somewhere across the bay, Garrett Sullivan was building a future on the foundation of everything stolen from him. She'd spent her whole life trying to be worthy of her father's legacy. Now she was learning what that legacy actually was, what it cost, who paid the price. 3 days later, instead of facing the truth, Vivian made a choice that would prove she'd learned her father's lessons too well. She called Donovan into her office at 7 in the morning, early enough that most of the building was still empty, early enough that what she was about to do could happen without witnesses. Fire him? Fire who? Donovan's confusion was genuine, his coffee still steaming in his hand, his mind not yet calibrated to the kind of decision his CEO was about to make. Garrett Sullivan, the janitor. I want him gone by noon. What? Why? He hasn't done anything wrong. He shows up on time, does his work, never causes problems. We have no grounds to. I don't need grounds. I'm the CEO. I can fire anyone I want for any reason or no reason at all. Employment at will. That's the law. Security will escort him out. Make sure he doesn't take anything from the building. Donovan stared at her for a long moment, something in his face suggesting he wanted to argue, wanted to understand what was happening behind Vivian's perfectly composed exterior, wanted to know when she'd become the kind of person who fired someone for humiliating her. Fine, I'll handle it. At 11:47, Garrett Sullivan was escorted out of Blackwood Aerospace Technologies by 2 security guards who looked uncomfortable with their assignment, who'd probably shared coffee with him in the break room, who'd treated him like a person rather than furniture. Vivian watched from her office window as he crossed the parking lot toward the Mustang, carrying nothing because 4 years of work had produced nothing he was allowed to keep. Because janitors didn't accumulate possessions at work beyond cleaning supplies that belonged to the company. He didn't look back at the building, didn't make a scene, didn't shout about injustice or threaten lawyers, or do any of the things angry people did when they felt wronged. Just opened the car door with that familiar squeal of hinges that needed oil, slid into the driver's seat with the careful movement of someone whose body hurt in ways invisible to observers. Turned the key. That sound again, that impossible, beautiful sound that rolled across the parking lot like proof of miracles, like evidence that the world contained more than quarterly reports and stock prices and the careful management of appearances. Then he drove away, and Vivian was left alone with the silence and the questions she couldn't answer, and the growing certainty that she just made a mistake she couldn't unmake. She thought she'd won, thought removing him would make the problem disappear, thought she could protect her father's legacy and her own future by eliminating the evidence of crimes she hadn't committed but had benefited from. She had no idea she'd just given him exactly what he needed. 6 days after Garrett Sullivan was fired, 6 days after Vivian thought she'd eliminated the problem, the news broke with the precision of someone who'd been preparing for exactly this moment, not for days, but for months. Garrett hadn't applied for federal funding after being fired. He'd applied 6 months ago, back in April, while still mopping Blackwood's floors, while still invisible, while Vivian walked past him every morning, not knowing he was building the future she thought she controlled. The approval had come through 2 weeks before the parking lot humiliation. The grant paperwork had been signed, the funding secured, the press conference scheduled. He'd been waiting, choosing his moment, calculating when public sympathy would be highest, when the narrative would be strongest, when Vivian would be most vulnerable. And her decision to fire him, to eliminate him like a problem that could be solved with security escorts and severance packages, had given him exactly the story he needed. The martyr narrative, the David versus Goliath framework, the scrappy underdog punished for having something the powerful wanted. Now, 6 days after what Vivian had thought was her victory, her phone rang at 3 in the morning for the second time in a month. Dr. Elaine Mercer, her head of engineering, sounded strange, tight, like someone trying to stay calm while watching disaster unfold in real time. Turn on the news, Channel 4, right now. Vivian fumbled for the remote, her penthouse bedroom still dark, the San Francisco skyline glittering outside her windows like circuitry, like the physical manifestation of systems she'd thought she understood. The screen flickered to life, showing a press conference in progress. Small podium, simple backdrop, modest production values that suggested this wasn't corporate theater, but something else, something more authentic, something that didn't need expensive staging. At the center stood Garrett Sullivan. He looked different, clean-shaven instead of the stubble he'd maintained as camouflage, wearing a simple suit that fit properly, that suggested he knew how to present himself when he chose to, that he'd been hiding rather than broken. His eyes were clear and focused, the exhaustion replaced by something else, purpose. His voice came through the speakers calm and measured, carrying the authority of someone who knew exactly what he was doing, who'd been planning this moment for longer than anyone realized. I'm pleased to announce that Apex Energy Systems has received federal funding of $22 million for the development of our clean energy propulsion system. This funding, approved 3 months ago and finalized 2 weeks ago, represents the government's recognition that this technology has the potential to revolutionize not just aerospace, but transportation as a whole. To change how we think about energy and motion and the limits we've accepted as permanent when they're actually just failures of imagination. Vivian couldn't breathe. Her coffee sat forgotten on the nightstand, growing cold in the darkness, irrelevant in the face of what was unfolding on screen. He'd had the money before she fired him, had the validation, had the future secured, and he'd waited, Let her humiliate him. Let her fire him. Let her think she had power when the balance had already shifted months ago. The Aurora engine is a self-sustaining power system that recycles its own energy output. This technology, which my late wife Elena and I developed together over 15 years ago, has already demonstrated continuous operation for 72 hours without any external fuel source, without degradation, without violating any laws of physics, but rather by understanding those laws better than the people who claim mastery. Reporters started shouting questions, voices overlapping in their urgency, in their recognition that this was the kind of story that could define careers, that could change industries, that mattered beyond the usual press conference platitudes. One voice cut through the noise louder than the rest, sharper, carrying accusation disguised as inquiry. Mr. Sullivan, is it true that this technology was stolen from you 15 years ago? That major aerospace companies suppressed your work to protect their own interests? That you've spent the last 4 years working as a janitor at the very company that destroyed your career? Garrett paused. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Some calculation about what to reveal and what to hold back, about how much truth the moment could bear. There will be a time to discuss the history of this technology, the forces that tried to bury it, the people who believe that innovation threatening their profits deserve to be destroyed. For now, I want to focus on the future, on what the Aurora engine can do for the world. My wife believed this technology could help people. She believed that science existed to serve humanity rather than the other way around. That's what matters. That's what I'm here to honor. But the reporter pressed harder, sensing blood. Mr. Sullivan, you were fired from Blackwood Aerospace just 6 days ago. Some would say the timing of this announcement is perfect. Garrett's interruption was soft, but carried the force of someone who'd been preparing this answer for months. Yes, I was fired. 6 days ago. After 4 years of faithful service. After never missing a shift, never causing problems, never giving anyone reason to terminate my employment, except that I refused to sell something that wasn't for sale. And yes, the timing is deliberate, because people need to understand that the same forces that tried to bury this technology 15 years ago are still trying to suppress it today. Still trying to control innovation rather than enable it. Still choosing profit over progress. Vivian muted the television but couldn't look away from the screen, from Garrett's face, from the calm certainty of someone who'd spent years preparing for exactly this moment. $22 million in federal funding secured months ago. A technology that could make her entire company obsolete. A narrative so perfect it might as well have been scripted. And Garrett Sullivan, the janitor she'd mocked and humiliated and fired, was now the face of the future while she sat in her penthouse, wearing pajamas that cost more than most people earned in a week, watching her world crack like glass under pressure. She'd thought firing him was her decision, her power, her control. She'd been dancing to music he'd been playing all along. 2 weeks after Garrett's announcement, the bomb dropped with the precision of someone who'd been planning exactly where to place it for maximum damage. Margot Cross, an investigative journalist with the San Francisco Chronicle, who'd built a career on exposing corruption and making powerful people uncomfortable, published a front-page exposé that landed like a declaration of war. The headline read, "Aerospace Giant Built on Stolen Dreams." Vivian read the article on her phone at 5 in the morning, coffee growing cold in her hand, the city still dark outside her windows, feeling like she was watching her own execution in slow motion. The story was thorough, devastating. Cross had interviewed former employees from Blackwood Aerospace's early days, people who'd retired or moved on, but remembered things they'd kept quiet about for years. She'd obtained internal documents through Freedom of Information requests, through sources within the company who'd apparently decided loyalty had limits, through the kind of determined digging that separated real journalism from press release regurgitation. She'd tracked down Garrett Sullivan and gotten his first public statement in 15 years. His first willingness to talk about what had been done to him and Elena. His first acknowledgement that silence had served its purpose but now required replacement with truth. My wife and I spent 7 years developing the Aurora engine. We believed it could help solve the climate crisis. We believed that making the world better was worth 7 years of our lives, working in a garage, maxing out credit cards, sacrificing everything normal people our age were supposed to want. We approached Colton Blackwood for funding and partnership because we were naive enough to think that innovation mattered more than profit, that good ideas would be rewarded rather than stolen. Instead, he stole our patents, destroyed our careers, threatened us with legal action we couldn't afford to fight, and left us with nothing. Elena died believing her life's work had been buried forever. I'm here to prove she was wrong. The article went on to detail the legal maneuvers Colton Blackwood had used to acquire the patents, the shell companies and offshore accounts, the intimidation tactics disguised as business negotiation, the systematic destruction of Garrett and Elena's professional reputations through whisper campaigns and strategic relationships with people who controlled access to funding and publication. Vivian's phone started ringing before she finished reading. Board members first, demanding explanations she didn't have. Then investors. Then lawyers. Then a text message that made everything else fade into background noise. From her ex-husband, brief and cold, Isla saw the news. She's asking questions I don't know how to answer. We need to talk about custody arrangements. This changes things. Vivian stared at the message, at the daughter she'd been too consumed with corporate crisis to think about, at the 12-year-old girl trying to understand why her mother's name was suddenly synonymous with corruption and theft. She typed a response 3 times and deleted it 3 times, finally settling on, "I'll call her tonight." The reply came immediately. "Too late. My lawyer will be in touch." By 9 in the morning, Blackwood Aerospace stock had dropped 18%, wiping out billions in market value, destroying retirement accounts and investment portfolios, and the carefully constructed wealth of people who trusted the company. By noon, 3 major institutional investors had requested emergency meetings, their polite language barely concealing threats to pull funding and crater the company completely. By 5 in the afternoon, Vivian's own board of directors had called for her resignation, their loyalty extending exactly as far as their own liability, their support evaporating the moment protecting her became more expensive than sacrificing her. She sat in her office as the sun set over San Francisco, watching her empire crumble in real time, every screen showing different aspects of the same disaster. News channels running the story, social media exploding with outrage. Justice for Garrett trending worldwide as millions of people who'd never heard of aerospace propulsion systems suddenly cared deeply about patent theft and corporate malfeasance. And the worst part, the part that made Vivian want to scream, was that she deserved it. Every word in that article was true. Her father had stolen the technology. She had tried to steal it again by ordering her team to replicate what Garrett had built. She had fired him when he wouldn't cooperate. She had fallen into the same patterns of taking rather than creating, because that's what Blackwoods did. That's what she'd learned by watching her father operate. That's what success looked like in her world. She was exactly what the world was calling her. A privileged heir who thought rules didn't apply to people with money and power and the right last name. Donovan knocked on her door around 7 in the evening, his face carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering bad news to someone who could still technically fire them, but probably wouldn't be in a position to do so much longer. The board wants an answer by morning. They're prepared to vote you out if you don't resign voluntarily. They think a clean break might salvage the company's reputation, might let them claim this was all you going rogue rather than systemic corruption. What would you do if you were me? Honestly, I'd resign, take a severance package, disappear for a year or 2 until this blows over. You're young enough to reinvent yourself somewhere else, in some other industry, with some other identity. Strategic retreat isn't the same as surrender. Vivian finally turned to face him, really face him, letting him see what the last few weeks had done to the careful mask she maintained. My father ran away from what he did. He buried it and pretended it never happened, and died believing he'd gotten away with it. And look where that got us. Look where it got me. Look at what his running away created. Look at my daughter reading about her grandfather's crimes and her mother's failures in the same article. Look at Garrett Sullivan standing in front of cameras, finally telling the truth my family spent 15 years trying to bury. Vivian, you can't fix this. The damage is done. Sullivan has federal funding, public sympathy, working technology, and moral high ground so secure you'd need climbing equipment to reach it. You have a failed replication effort and a public relations nightmare. There's no path forward here, no strategy that salvages this. Maybe not for the company, but maybe there's a path forward for me. Maybe I can choose to be something other than Colton Blackwood's daughter for the first time in my life. Donovan stared at her with confusion crossing his face, like clouds blocking sun. What are you talking about? I'm talking about doing something my father never did, something I've never done, something that scares me more than losing everything because I've spent my whole life avoiding it. She walked to her desk and picked up her keys, feeling the weight of them, feeling the weight of everything they represented. I'm talking about telling the truth, but first, before press conferences and public confessions, before trying to salvage what can't be saved, I need to do something else my father never did. I need to face the person I hurt. Not through lawyers or press releases or carefully managed statements. Face to face, human to human, with nothing between us except the truth I've spent weeks running from. Vivian drove for 45 minutes before she found the address, navigating Oakland streets that got progressively less polished, less maintained, less interested in pretending prosperity was universal. Apex Energy Systems operated out of a converted warehouse in an industrial district where graffiti competed with murals, and nobody bothered distinguishing between art and vandalism. The building looked modest, simple signage that didn't try to impress, a small parking lot where the Mustang sat like a rust-colored monument to endurance, to refusing to quit, to carrying something precious through years that tried to break it. Through the windows, she could see lights burning despite the late hour, engineers working while the rest of the world slept, machines humming with the sound of progress being made by people who believed in what they were building rather than just collecting paychecks. Vivian parked her Mercedes beside the Mustang and sat for a long moment, gathering courage she wasn't sure she possessed, trying to find words for what she needed to say, trying to imagine a version of this conversation that didn't end with Garrett telling her to leave and never come back. Then she got out and walked to the front door, each step feeling like movement towards something she couldn't take back, toward a version of herself she'd never been brave enough to become. The door was unlocked. She stepped inside and found herself in a workshop filled with engine parts and diagnostic equipment and the organized chaos of serious innovation happening in real time. A dozen engineers looked up from their work, surprised to see a stranger, recognizing her face from news coverage, their expressions shifting from curiosity to hostility as they placed her. And at the center of it all stood Garrett Sullivan, hands covered in grease, eyes fixed on Vivian with an expression she couldn't read, but felt in her chest, like pressure. Everyone out. His voice came quiet, but carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind of command that didn't need volume because everyone listening understood that disagreement wasn't an option. The engineers hesitated, glancing at each other, clearly wanting to stay and witness whatever was about to happen, clearly concerned about leaving their boss alone with the daughter of the man who destroyed his life. Now, they filed past Vivian without speaking, their silence more damning than any words they could have used. Their presence a reminder that she'd come here as a representative of theft and cruelty disguised as business. In 30 seconds, the workshop was empty except for the two of them, except for the machinery still humming in the background, except for the weight of everything unsaid for 15 years, suddenly demanding acknowledgement. Garrett wiped his hands on a rag, not hurrying, letting the silence build, letting Vivian stand in her discomfort like someone who'd earned it. How did you find this place? It's listed in the federal grant documentation, public record. Anyone who wanted to look could find it without trying very hard. And you came here because Vivian took a breath that felt like it might be her last, as the person she'd been for 43 years. Like inhaling before going underwater, not knowing if she'd surface again. I came to apologize. The silence that followed stretched like wire pulled too tight, like the moment before something breaks under tension it can't sustain. Vivian pushed forward before she could lose her nerve, before fear could convince her that retreat was safer than honesty. I read my father's files. I know what he did to you, to Elena. I know how he stole your work and destroyed your careers, and threatened you with lawsuits you couldn't afford to fight. I know he took everything and left you with nothing except grief and the knowledge that the system rewards people like him while punishing people like you. Garrett's expression didn't change, didn't give her anything to work with, didn't make this easier. And I'm sorry, not just for what he did, for what I did, for mocking you in front of the whole company like your pain was entertainment, for trying to buy your car like everything has a price if you just offer enough money, for firing you when you wouldn't give me what I wanted because I'm Colton Blackwood's daughter and we take what we want without asking permission, for trying to steal your technology again because apparently I learned my father's lessons better than I realized. Is this supposed to make me feel better? Supposed to balance some cosmic scale? Supposed to mean something beyond making you feel less guilty? No, this is supposed to be the truth. Something my family hasn't been very good at telling. Something I haven't been brave enough to face until the world forced me to. Garrett set down the rag and leaned against a workbench, studying her with dark eyes that had seen too much loss to be easily impressed by apologies. Your father came to me once, about a year after he took the patents. Elena was already sick by then, already dying though we didn't know how fast, already showing the symptoms we'd been ignoring because acknowledging them meant acknowledging we were running out of time. We were drowning in medical bills, couldn't afford lawyers, couldn't afford to fight someone with unlimited resources. And he showed up at our apartment in a $3,000 suit, carrying an envelope, offering to make things right. Vivian felt sick, bile rising in her throat, knowing what was coming but needing to hear it anyway. What did he offer? $200,000. Hush money dressed up as generosity. Sign a confidentiality agreement that prevented us from ever discussing the Aurora engine or the circumstances of how he acquired it. Walk away, never speak of this again, take the money and disappear, and let him own not just our work, but our silence. His jaw tightened, and Vivian saw the 15-year-old wound opening fresh, saw the pain that never actually healed, but just learned to hide itself better. Elena was dying. We needed that money. Could have used it for treatment that insurance wouldn't cover, for experimental therapies that might have given us more time, for comfort in her final months, instead of watching her suffer because we couldn't afford proper pain management. And you know what she said when I told her about his offer? Vivian shook her head, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She said, "Some things are worth more than money. Some things are worth more than survival. If we take his offer, we'll be dead inside long before the cancer finishes me. If we keep our integrity, at least one thing survives. At least we die knowing we didn't sell out. At least there's that." His voice broke slightly on the last words, grief still raw after 15 years, loss that didn't fade but just became familiar. She died 3 months later. Never saw a dime of that money. Never saw her work validated or her name in journals or any recognition that her 7 years mattered. But she died with her integrity intact. She died knowing that we chose principle over survival because some choices define who you are in ways that outlast whatever consequences follow. Tears were streaming down Vivian's face now, hot and unwelcome and impossible to stop. I can't give back what my father took, can't resurrect Elena or give her the recognition she deserved while she could appreciate it. Can't undo 15 years of injustice and pain and watching the world reward the people who hurt you. But I can stop being the person I've been. I can stop being him. I can choose differently, even if choosing differently cost me everything I thought defined my worth. And how exactly do you plan to do that? What grand gesture makes this right? What amount of penance balances the scale? I don't know yet. I just know I had to start here, with you, with the truth, with admitting what was done and what I tried to do and who I've been, with standing in front of the person I hurt and not making excuses or offering money or trying to buy my way out of consequences. The workshop hummed around them, machinery idling, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the physical space between them feeling like a chasm that might be too wide to cross. Garrett was quiet for so long Vivian thought he might just tell her to leave, might decide that apologies were worthless and she wasn't worth the effort of forgiveness, might choose to let her carry this weight for the rest of her life as fair payment for what had been stolen. Then he walked to a shelf and pulled down a thick binder, its pages yellowed with age, its cover worn from handling, from years of being opened and studied and treated like scripture. He held it for a moment, weighing it in his hands like he was weighing her soul, like he was deciding whether she deserved what he was about to offer. You know what I remember most about Elena? Not her brilliance, though she was brilliant. Not her determination, though she never quit on anything that mattered. What I remember is that she believed in second chances, not because people deserve them, most of the time they don't, but because she believed that people can change, that the worst version of ourselves doesn't have to be the final version, that transformation is possible if you're willing to do the work, even when the work destroys everything you thought you were. He held the binder out to Vivian, offering it like a test, like a challenge, like an opportunity that came with conditions she didn't yet understand. These are the original Aurora engine specifications, handwritten by me and Elena. Everything your father couldn't steal because we kept the critical components in our heads rather than on paper, because we learned not to trust documentation after he showed us what people with lawyers could do to written agreements. Vivian stared at the binder like it might explode, like accepting it meant accepting something bigger than technical specifications. Why would you give this to me? I'm not giving it to you. I'm testing you. Garrett's eyes were hard now, all the softness gone, all the vulnerability replaced by the kind of strength that comes from losing everything and surviving anyway. Take this home, study it. If you can understand what Elena and I built, not just the mechanics but the philosophy, the reasoning, the heart of it, then maybe you're capable of being someone different than your father. Maybe you can learn that some things matter more than profit. Maybe you can transform from someone who takes into someone who builds. And if you can't, if you just see this as another opportunity to exploit, then you'll prove you're exactly who I think you are, and this conversation will be the last we ever have. How long do I have? As long as it takes. There's no deadline except your own capacity for change. No clock except your willingness to become someone worth knowing. Garrett turned back to his work, dismissing her without ceremony, without gentleness, without making this easier than it needed to be. Close the door on your way out. Vivian walked out into the Oakland night, clutching the binder to her chest like a lifeline, like a map to territory she'd never explored, like evidence that redemption might be possible, even for people who didn't deserve it. Behind her, the lights of Apex Energy Systems glowed warm against the darkness. In her hands, she held the key to redemption. She just didn't know yet if she was strong enough to turn it. Vivian didn't go back to her penthouse, couldn't face the empty rooms and expensive furniture, and the view of a city that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else, to a version of herself she was trying to leave behind, but didn't yet know how to replace. Instead, she drove to a storage facility in Menlo Park, showed ID to a bored attendant who didn't care why someone in a Mercedes wanted to rent the largest unit available at 11 at night, signed papers that made her legally responsible for a 10 by 20 rectangle of concrete and metal. Then she started making calls. "I need equipment." Dr. Elaine Mercer sounded half asleep on the other end, confusion evident even through the phone's compression. "Vivian, the board is meeting in 3 hours. They're going to vote you out. You have to be there. You have to defend yourself, or at least try to salvage something from this disaster." "I know. I'm not going to the meeting." "What? You have to be there. You can't just—" "I'm done defending who I was. I'm going to become someone worth defending. Send me the equipment, Elaine. Machine tools, diagnostic systems, everything we used for the prototype attempts. I'll pay for it myself. I'll max out every credit card I have. Just send it." She hung up before Elaine could argue, before doubt could convince her this was insane, before the rational part of her brain could point out that she had no idea what she was doing. Over the next 6 hours, she transformed the storage unit into a workshop. She bought parts and materials with money that had always been abstract, that had never meant sacrifice before, because there was always more coming. She downloaded software and watched tutorial videos and read technical manuals until her eyes burned and her head ached and exhaustion made the words blur together. At 2 in the afternoon, her phone buzzed with a news alert. Blackwood Aerospace Board removes CEO Vivian Blackwood in unanimous vote. She read the headline, set down her phone, got back to work. The first prototype took her 8 days to build, and it was ugly, clumsy. The welds were uneven because she'd never welded before, and YouTube tutorials couldn't replace years of practice. The connections were imprecise because her hands weren't trained for this kind of work, weren't calibrated to the tolerances that mattered when building something that operated on principles most engineers didn't understand. Her hands blistered and bled. She burned herself twice with the soldering iron, the pain sharp and immediate, and somehow clarifying. She hit her thumb with a hammer hard enough to turn the nail black, hard enough that weeks later it would fall off, and she'd keep it as a reminder of what transformation cost. She spent one entire night crying in frustration when a circuit board she'd spent 12 hours assembling turned out to be wired backward, when all that work became waste, when failure felt like proof she'd been right to doubt herself. But she kept going because stopping meant admitting Garrett was right to doubt her, meant confirming she was Colton Blackwood's daughter in every way that mattered, meant accepting that people like her didn't change because change required suffering they weren't willing to endure. She slept on an air mattress in the corner of the storage unit, the concrete hard beneath her even through the cushion, her body aching in ways it never had when she'd slept on a mattress that cost $5,000. She ate takeout from the Chinese place down the street, sometimes forgetting to eat at all, until hunger made her hands shake and her vision blur, and her body reminded her that it still had needs, even when her mind was elsewhere. She showered at a truck stop 3 blocks away, standing in stalls that smelled like industrial cleaner and diesel fuel, surrounded by people whose lives operated on economics she'd never understood, whose exhaustion came from physical labor rather than quarterly reports. On day 8, she connected the power cell and turned on her prototype, holding her breath like someone waiting for a verdict, like someone whose entire future depended on the next few seconds. It ran for 4 seconds before the energy loop collapsed and the whole system overheated, smoke rising from components that couldn't handle the stress, failure announcing itself with the smell of burning electronics. Vivian sat on the concrete floor staring at the smoking wreckage of her work and felt something she hadn't felt in years, something that wasn't anger or frustration or the urge to blame someone else for her failures. Determination, pure and clean and focused. The certainty that failure meant try again rather than give up. She went back to the binder, reading the section on energy loop stabilization 3 more times, finding a notation in Elena's handwriting that she'd missed before. The words almost lost in the margin, but carrying weight once she saw them. The key is patience. The system needs time to find its rhythm. Don't force it, guide it. Let it teach you what it needs rather than imposing what you think it should do. Don't force it, guide it. Vivian thought about how she'd lived her whole life. Forcing, demanding, taking, never guiding, never waiting, never trusting anything to develop naturally because natural development took time, and time meant other people might get ahead while she exercised patience. She rebuilt the prototype, took her time, paid attention to the rhythm Elena described in notes written 15 years ago by a woman who'd understood something fundamental that most engineers missed. When she connected the power cell again, she didn't slam the switch like she was commanding the machine to obey. She eased it gently, like coaxing a frightened animal, like inviting rather than demanding. The engine ran for 30 seconds, then 45, then 1 minute and 12 seconds before it failed. Progress. 3 weeks into her exile, Fletcher Hayes found her. He stood in the doorway of the storage unit, staring at the chaos inside. The scattered tools, the failed prototypes, the sleeping bag in the corner. The woman who used to run a $4 billion company, now wearing stained coveralls and a ponytail held together with a rubber band. My God, what have you done to yourself? Vivian didn't look up from the circuit board she was soldering. Didn't break her concentration because breaking concentration meant starting over. And she'd already started over too many times today. I'm learning. Learning what? How to destroy your life? Vivian, the board has frozen your assets pending investigation. Securities fraud, intellectual property theft, conspiracy. You're looking at potential prison time, and you're living in a storage unit like someone who's given up on everything that matters. I'm not giving up. I'm building something that actually matters for the first time in my life. Fletcher walked closer, stepping carefully around debris on the floor. His expensive shoes, not designed for workshops, where people created things with their hands. He picked up the binder Garrett had given her, flipped through a few pages, set it down again with the careful reverence of someone who recognized significance even when he didn't understand details. He gave you this. He's testing me. If I can build the engine, he'll know I'm serious about changing. If I can understand what he and Elena created, not just mechanically but philosophically, then maybe I'm capable of being someone different than my father. And if you can't, then I'll keep trying until I can. Because trying is the only thing I have left. Because admitting defeat means accepting that Colton Blackwood's daughter can never be anything except what he made her. Fletcher sat down heavily in a folding chair that creaked under his weight, his age showing in ways it usually didn't, exhaustion making him look every one of his 68 years. You need to know something. Your ex-husband is filing for full custody of Isla. He's arguing that you're mentally unstable, that this whole situation proves you're unfit to parent. He has lawyers and character witnesses and a strong case that you've abandoned your daughter to pursue some delusional fantasy in a storage unit. The soldering iron slipped in Vivian's hand, nearly burning her again, nearly adding another scar to the collection she was accumulating. Isla, her daughter, 12 years old, living with her father since the scandal broke because Vivian had been too consumed with corporate crisis management to think about what this meant for a child trying to understand why her mother's name was suddenly synonymous with corruption. When's the hearing? 2 weeks. He wants emergency temporary custody while the permanent case proceeds. And honestly, Vivian, looking at you now, looking at this, I don't know how you fight it. I don't know how you convince a judge that you're stable and capable when you're living like this. Vivian set down the soldering iron, really looking at Fletcher for the first time since he'd arrived, seeing the concern in his face, the worry of someone who'd known her since birth and was watching her potentially destroy herself. Then I have 2 weeks to finish the engine and prove I'm building something rather than falling apart. 2 weeks to show that transformation looks like chaos before it looks like progress. 2 weeks to become someone my daughter can be proud of instead of ashamed of. Fletcher reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, placed it on the workbench with the gentleness of someone handling something precious. Before I came here, I liquidated some of my own holdings. Cash, untraceable, $80,000. It's not enough to live like you used to, but it's enough to rent an apartment where Isla can visit, where you can show a judge you have stability. Enough to hire a lawyer who can fight your ex-husband's custody grab. Enough to prove you're not giving up on being a mother while you're learning to be someone different. Why would you do this? After everything my father did? After knowing what he was? Because I failed your father once. I watched him do terrible things and said nothing, did nothing, enabled him by refusing to oppose him. I won't make the same mistake with you. I won't watch you destroy yourself without at least trying to help you build something better. He stood to leave, paused at the door without turning around. Be better than him, Vivian. That's all I ask. Be someone Elena Sullivan would have respected. Be someone your daughter can look up to. Be someone who builds instead of takes. That's the only redemption that matters. Then he was gone, leaving Vivian alone with her work and her binder and the ghost of a woman she'd never met but was learning to honor through the painful process of becoming someone new. The breakthrough came on day 37. Vivian had rebuilt the prototype 9 times. Each version ran longer, performed better, came closer to achieving the stable energy loop that Elena's notes described, but Vivian's understanding couldn't quite grasp. She'd learned to read Elena's handwriting like a second language, to anticipate Garrett's logic, to understand the philosophy behind every design choice. The Aurora engine wasn't just about energy recapture, it was about harmony. Every component had to work with every other component, not against it. The system couldn't be forced or dominated. It had to be balanced, guided, respected. Just like Elena had written, just like Vivian had spent 43 years not understanding. She made one final adjustment, a small change to the energy flow regulator, something she'd overlooked a dozen times before, but suddenly saw clearly. The kind of insight that comes when you've stared at a problem so long, your brain rewires itself around the answer. She connected the power cell, held her breath, turned the key. The engine started, smooth, quiet, perfect. Vivian watched the diagnostic readouts, waiting for the collapse, waiting for the overheat warning, waiting for failure because failure had become familiar and success felt impossible. 5 minutes passed, 10, 20. The energy loop held. The system recycled its own output, feeding back into itself, sustaining motion without external fuel, proving that everything she'd been taught about thermodynamics was incomplete rather than wrong. Vivian sat down on the concrete floor and cried, not from exhaustion, though she was exhausted, not from relief, though she was relieved. She cried because for the first time in her life she'd built something real, something true, something that mattered beyond quarterly reports and stock prices and the careful management of appearances. And she cried because she understood now what Garrett had lost. The woman who'd written those notes, the woman who dreamed these dreams, the woman who'd poured her heart into this impossible vision. Elena was gone, and all the money in the world couldn't bring her back, couldn't give her the recognition she deserved, couldn't undo the injustice of dying before seeing her work validated. Vivian cried for Elena Sullivan, a woman she'd never known and could never thank. And somewhere in those tears, she found the person she wanted to become. She called Garrett the next morning, her voice steady despite everything, despite fear and hope, and the knowledge that this call would determine whether redemption was possible. It works. The engine. I built it. It's been running for 14 hours without degradation, without external input, without violating any laws except the ones we made up to explain our own limitations. Silence on the other end of the line, long enough that she thought he might hang up, might decide her success meant nothing. Then his voice came back changed, carrying something that might have been surprise. You actually did it. I want to show you. I need you to see that I understand what you and Elena created. Not just the mechanics, the meaning, the philosophy, the belief that waste can become wealth and loss can become gain if you're willing to do the work of transformation. Why does that matter to you? Because I need someone to believe that people can change, that I can change, that the worst version of myself doesn't have to be permanent. I need you to witness that I'm capable of being something other than Colton Blackwood's daughter. More silence. Then, I'll be there in 2 hours. Don't touch anything. Garrett arrived exactly when he said he would, examining every connection, every circuit, every component with the care of someone who'd spent 15 years protecting this work, who'd lost too much to be careless now. He checked the readings, ran his own diagnostics, monitored the system for any sign of degradation, looking for flaws, because finding flaws meant maintaining the distance that kept him safe. 15 minutes passed in silence. Finally, he turned to face her, and something in his expression had shifted. Some calculation revised, some assessment updated. This configuration, the adjustment you made to the flow regulator, it's not in the binder. I know, I figured it out on my own, based on something Elena wrote about harmony, about every component working with every other component. I realized the original design had a small imbalance in the feedback loop. The change corrects it. Garrett stared at her in a way that made Vivian's chest tighten, made breathing difficult. You improved it. You actually improved our design. Elena and I spent 7 years knowing that imbalance was there, but couldn't figure out how to fix it. And you found the answer in 37 days. I didn't mean to. I was just trying to make it work. No, he shook his head slowly, wonder creeping into his voice. You did more than make it work. You understood it. You internalized Elena's philosophy deeply enough to see what we couldn't see. That's not luck, that's transformation. He picked up the binder, flipped through pages covered with Vivian's notes, her calculations, her questions and answers written in margins beside Elena's original text. She would have liked this. Elena. She would have liked seeing her work continue, seeing someone else understand what we were trying to do, seeing that the ideas survive even when the people who created them don't. I wish I could have met her. So do I. She would have seen what you're becoming before you saw it yourself. She was good at that, good at recognizing potential in people everyone else had written off. He set down the binder and extended his hand, offering it across the space between them like a bridge, like an invitation, like evidence that maybe second chances were real. I need a partner. Apex Energy is growing faster than I can handle alone. The federal grant is just the beginning. We have interest from airlines, from governments, from companies worldwide. I need someone who understands the technology, believes in the mission, and has the skills to navigate the business side without compromising the principles that make this matter. Vivian looked at his hand, rough, calloused, marked by years of labor that built rather than took. She thought about her own hands, transformed by 37 days of work that left scars she'd carry forever. That marked her as someone who'd chosen to become rather than remain. I'll work harder than anyone you've ever met. I'll do whatever it takes to earn this chance. I'll prove every day that I'm someone worth trusting. I know you will. He released her hand after the shake, walked toward the door, paused at the threshold. Shut down the engine. Pack your things. You start tomorrow. And Vivian, she looked up at him. Don't thank me yet. The hard part is just beginning. Building something that matters is always harder than destroying something that doesn't. Then he walked out into the California morning, leaving Vivian alone with the engine and the binder and the future she was finally ready to build. The future where waste could become wealth, where loss could become gain, where the worst versions of ourselves didn't have to be permanent, where even people who'd spent their lives taking could learn to build instead. She shut down the engine and started packing, knowing that transformation was never finished, only continued. Knowing that redemption wasn't a destination, but a direction. Knowing that Elena Sullivan's dream was alive, not because it had been protected, but because it had been shared. Some revolutions started with thunder, others with whispers. And some, the ones that mattered most, started with a rusted car, an impossible engine, and two people brave enough to believe that broken things could run again, if you were willing to do the work of repair.